I'm Sarah Chen, 38 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my family has called me the dumb one. While my older brother Marcus graduated from Harvard Law and my younger sister Emma became a successful investment banker, I was the family disappointment who barely scraped through community college. At every family gathering, the jokes never stopped. Sarah's just not academic material, my mother would say with that pitying smile. Some people are just better with their hands. But 3 weeks ago, everything changed when I opened that acceptance letter from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. The same family that had written me off as their biggest failure was about to discover that their dumb daughter had just been accepted into one of the most prestigious medical programs in the country. What they didn't know was that I had been secretly preparing for this moment for 5 years, and their years of humiliation were about to come full circle. Like and subscribe. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, to understand how monumental this moment was, you need to know about my family's golden children. Marcus, my older brother by 3 years, had been the family star since kindergarten. Straight A's, valedictorian, full scholarship to Harvard, law review editor, and now a partner at one of Boston's most prestigious law firms. His corner office overlooked the harbor, and his annual salary was something my parents loved to mention at dinner parties. Then there was Emma, 2 years younger than me, who seemed to excel at everything without even trying. While I struggled to pass basic math, she was doing calculus for fun in middle school. She graduated summa cum laude from Wharton, landed a job at Goldman Sachs straight out of college, and by 26 was pulling in a 7-figure salary managing investment portfolios for high-net-worth clients. And then there was me, Sarah, the afterthought. That the family photo from Marcus's Harvard graduation still sits prominently on my mother's mantelpiece. There's Marcus in his cap and gown, beaming with pride, flanked by our parents who look like they might burst with joy. Emma stands beside him in a designer dress, already accepted to Wharton for the fall. And there I am, barely visible in the back corner, wearing an ill-fitting dress from Target, looking uncomfortable and out of place. That photo perfectly captured the family dynamic. I wasn't just the middle child, I was the invisible child, the one who somehow didn't inherit the Chen family intelligence gene. While my siblings were winning academic awards and scholarships, I was struggling to maintain a C average and getting pulled into guidance counselor meetings about my potential and different learning style. My parents, both immigrants who had worked tirelessly to build successful careers, my father as a chemical engineer, my mother as a pharmacist, couldn't understand how they had produced such different children. They'd look at my report cards with the same expression you might have when finding a broken appliance, disappointed but resigned to the fact that some things just don't work properly. Sarah tries her best became my mother's standard response when other parents asked about my academic performance. It was said with the same tone you might use to describe a beloved pet with a chronic illness, affectionate but ultimately pitying. The worst part wasn't even the academic comparisons. It was the way my achievements, no matter how hard won, were minimized or dismissed. When I finally graduated from community college with my associate's degree in general studies, the family celebration lasted exactly as long as it took to eat cake. When Marcus passed the bar exam, we had a dinner party with 30 guests. When Emma got her first promotion, my parents took her to an expensive steakhouse. When I landed my first full-time job as a medical receptionist, my mother simply said, "Well, at least you'll have health insurance." The message was clear. I was the family's underachiever, and everyone had accepted it as an unchangeable fact of nature. Even I had started to believe it. The breaking point came during my high school graduation party. I had somehow managed to graduate, despite a transcript littered with C's and D's that my parents had quietly hidden away like a shameful family secret. While other families celebrated their children's achievements with pride, mine treated my graduation like a relief, as if we'd all narrowly avoided a disaster. I remember standing in our backyard, watching my extended family congratulate Marcus on his upcoming Harvard acceptance, while Emma charmed everyone with stories about her internship at a prestigious consulting firm. I held my own report card in my hands, the one that had caused so many heated discussions between my parents behind closed doors. "Sarah has always been our creative one," my aunt said, trying to be kind. "Not everyone needs to be academic." My mother nodded knowingly. "She's just not built for school. We've accepted that." But that night, alone in my room, I stared at that report card and felt something shift inside me. Those grades weren't just numbers on a page, they were evidence of a system that had failed me and that I had failed to understand. For years, I had sat in classrooms where information seemed to bounce off my brain like rain on a windshield. I would read the same paragraph 5 times and still not comprehend it. I would study for hours only to freeze up during tests, watching my mind go completely blank. Everyone assumed I was lazy or simply not intelligent enough, but deep down, I knew something else was wrong. The way letters seemed to swim on the page sometimes, the way I could understand complex concepts when they were explained verbally but couldn't process them from textbooks. The way I needed to move or fidget to concentrate. These weren't signs of stupidity. They were clues to something nobody had bothered to investigate. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to figure out what was wrong with me. And then I was going to prove that I was more than my family's low expectations. I didn't know how yet, but I knew that the girl who couldn't seem to learn algebra might still have something to offer the world. I carefully folded that report card and tucked it away in my desk drawer. Years later, when I was struggling through my hardest moments of medical school preparation, I would pull it out and remember the night I decided to stop accepting other people's definitions of my limitations. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents, both successful in healthcare-related fields, had never considered that their daughter might have an undiagnosed learning disability. They had simply accepted that I was different and moved on. But I was about to discover that different didn't mean inferior, it just meant I needed to find my own path to success. Little did I know that this decision would lead me down a road that would eventually take me to the halls of one of the most prestigious medical schools in the country. All I knew that night was that I was tired of being the dumb one, and I was finally ready to do something about it. The first MCAT prep book I ever bought was hidden under my bed like contraband. I was 23, working as a receptionist at a family practice clinic, and living in a studio apartment that I could barely afford. The idea of medical school seemed as impossible as climbing Mount Everest in flip-flops, but something inside me wouldn't let the dream die. I had spent 2 years after community college working various jobs, pseudo food service, temp work, trying to figure out what to do with my life. My parents had stopped asking about my plans and had settled into treating me like a permanent work in progress, but working at the clinic had awakened something in me. I loved the medical environment, the way doctors could diagnose problems and provide solutions, the genuine care I saw in their interactions with patients. One afternoon, while filing patient charts, I overheard Dr. Martinez explaining a complex cardiac procedure to a worried family member. The way she broke down the medical terminology, the compassion in her voice, the authority she commanded, I wanted that. I wanted to be the person who could heal others, who could make life and death decisions, who could give families hope. That's when I started researching what it would take to become a doctor. The requirements seemed overwhelming. Prerequisite courses I'd never taken, A&M CAT score that seemed impossibly high, extracurricular activities that demonstrated commitment to medicine, and grades that were far beyond anything I'd ever achieved. But I also discovered something else. People who had taken unconventional paths to medicine, students who had gone back to school later in life, who had overcome learning disabilities, who had transformed themselves from academic failures into successful doctors. If they could do it, maybe I could too. I bought that first MCAT prep book, with money I should have spent on groceries. The Princeton Review, MCAT Subject Review, complete set cost me $200, a fortune on my $12 an hour salary. I told myself it was an investment in my future, but honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it. The book was intimidating. Organic chemistry, physics, biology, psychology, subjects I'd never studied or had struggled with in community college. I would open it after work, sitting on my small couch under the harsh fluorescent light of my apartment, and try to make sense of concepts that seemed designed for people much smarter than me. The first few weeks were brutal. I would read the same page over and over, feeling like I was trying to understand a foreign language. My old patterns emerged, the frustration, the self-doubt, the voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my mother saying, "Some people just aren't academic material." But I kept going. I developed a routine: work 8 hours at the clinic, grab dinner from the dollar menu, then study until my eyes burned. I covered my walls with handwritten notes and diagrams, turning my tiny apartment into a shrine to my impossible dream. The hardest part wasn't the material, it was the secrecy. I couldn't tell my family what I was doing. They would have either laughed or launched into a well-meaning lecture about being realistic and playing to my strengths. So I studied in silence, nurturing this fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, I could reinvent myself into someone worthy of a white coat. Everything changed when I was 24 and finally got tested for learning disabilities. It had taken me a year of struggling with MCAT prep to realize that maybe the problem wasn't my intelligence, maybe it was how my brain processed information. The testing took place over 2 long days in a sterile office building downtown. Dr. Patricia Williams, a neuropsychologist, put me through a battery of tests that measured everything from working memory to processing speed to attention span. For hours, I completed puzzles, read passages, solved math problems, and answered questions about my academic history. When the results came back 2 weeks later, I sat in Dr. Williams' office, feeling like I was about to receive a life sentence. Instead, I got an explanation that finally made sense of my entire academic career. Sarah, you have ADHD with a specific learning disability in reading comprehension and working memory, she said, sliding a thick report across her desk. Your IQ is actually in the superior range, 128, to be exact. You're not lacking intelligence. Your brain just processes information differently. I stared at the report, reading the words over and over. Superior range. My whole life, I had been told I wasn't smart enough, and here was scientific proof that I was actually above average. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the anger. How many years had I spent believing I was intellectually inferior when the real problem was that nobody had bothered to figure out how I learned best? Dr. Williams explained that ADHD made it difficult for me to sustain attention on tasks that weren't immediately engaging, which explained why I could hyperfocus on things I found interesting but couldn't sit through a traditional lecture. The working memory issues meant I had trouble holding multiple pieces of information in my mind simultaneously, which made complex problem solving and reading comprehension challenging. The good news, she continued, is that there are strategies and medications that can help. Many successful professionals have ADHD. You just need to learn how to work with your brain instead of against it. That afternoon, I called in sick to work and drove to the nearest bookstore. I bought every book I could find about ADHD and learning strategies. For the first time in my life, I understood why traditional studying methods had never worked for me. I needed movement, visual aids, frequent breaks, and information presented in multiple formats. I also started medication, a low dose of Adderall, that made an immediate difference. Suddenly, I could read a textbook page without my mind wandering to 5 different topics. I could sit through online lectures without feeling like I needed to jump out of my skin. The constant mental static that had plagued me my entire life quieted to a manageable hum, but the most profound change was internal. For 24 years, I had carried the shame of being the dumb one. That diagnosis lifted that burden off my shoulders. I wasn't lazy or stupid or lacking in potential. I was a person with a neurological difference who had been trying to succeed in a system that wasn't designed for how my brain worked. Armed with this new understanding, I threw myself back into MCAT preparation with renewed determination. This time, instead of fighting against my brain, I worked with it. I used colorful markers and diagrams, studied in short bursts with frequent breaks, and found ways to make the material engaging and relevant. The girl who had struggled to pass high school chemistry was about to tackle organic chemistry with accommodations, medications, and most importantly, the knowledge that she was absolutely capable of success. The color-coded study schedule taped to my wall became my Bible. Every hour of every day was planned, categorized, and optimized for maximum learning efficiency. Red for organic chemistry, blue for physics, green for biology, yellow for psychology. My tiny apartment looked like a rainbow had exploded. But, for the first time in my life, I had a system that worked with my ADHD brain instead of against it. The grind was relentless. I would wake up at 5 a.m., take my medication with a protein-rich breakfast, and start studying before my brain had time to convince me it was too hard. 2 hours of focused study, 30-minute break with physical activity, then back to the books. I followed this pattern religiously for 3 years. Working full-time at the clinic while preparing for the MCA meant sacrificing everything that resembled the social life, while my former high school classmates were posting pictures of weekend trips and dinner parties on social media. I was hunched over molecular structures and physics equations. My Friday nights were spent in the library, my Saturdays at the coffee shop with my laptop and a stack of practice tests. The prerequisite courses were another mountain to climb. Since I'd only completed general education requirements at community college, I needed to take organic chemistry, physics, advanced biology, and biochemistry. While working 40 hours a week, I enrolled in evening and weekend classes at the local state university, paying out of pocket because I didn't qualify for financial aid. Those chemistry labs were humbling. I was often the oldest student in the class, surrounded by who seemed to grasp concepts effortlessly. When they complained about how hard organic chemistry was, I wanted to laugh. They had no idea what hard really looked like. Hard was being 26 years old, exhausted from a full day of work, trying to memorize reaction mechanisms while your family thought you were just going through a phase. My study schedule became increasingly elaborate as I learned more about how my brain worked. I discovered that I retained information better when I wrote it out by hand, so I filled notebook after notebook with meticulous notes. I learned that I could focus better with background white noise, so I invested in noise-canceling headphones. I realized that I needed to associate complex concepts with visual images, so my walls became covered with hand-drawn diagrams of cellular respiration and the citric acid cycle. The financial strain was enormous. Between tuition for prerequisite classes, MCAT prep materials, application fees, and living expenses, I was burning through every penny I earned. I picked up extra shifts at the clinic whenever possible, sometimes working 12-hour days before heading to evening chemistry lab. I ate ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for months at a time. But the hardest part was the isolation. I couldn't tell my family what I was doing because I wasn't ready for their skepticism or their well-meaning attempts to manage my expectations. As far as they knew, I was just taking some continuing education classes to advance in my receptionist role. The few friends I had gradually drifted away as I turned down invitation after invitation to go out. There were nights when I questioned my sanity, sitting alone in my apartment at midnight, staring at organic chemistry mechanisms that still looked like hieroglyphics. I would wonder if I was delusional to think I could become a doctor. The voice of my old high school guidance counselor would echo in my mind, maybe you should consider something more practical. But then I would think about Dr. Martinez at the clinic, the way she changed people's lives every day, and I would open my textbook again. The color-coded schedule on my wall wasn't just a study plan, it was a roadmap to becoming the person I knew I could be, if I was just willing to work harder than anyone thought possible. The hospital volunteer badge I wore every Saturday became my favorite accessory. It was a small, plastic rectangle with my photo and the words, volunteer, patient care. But to me, it represented everything I was working toward. St. Mary's Hospital had accepted me into their volunteer program, and for 4 hours every weekend, I got to exist in the world I desperately wanted to join. I started in the most basic role possible, escorting patients to appointments, delivering lab results, and restocking supply closets. The work was simple, but being surrounded by the controlled chaos of a hospital environment felt like coming home. The beeping monitors, the hushed conversations between doctors and nurses, the way everyone moved with purpose and urgency, all fascinated me. Dr. Sarah Kim, a resident in internal medicine, was the first person in the medical field who treated me like I had potential. She noticed that I asked thoughtful questions and genuinely cared about the patients we encountered. When she learned I was taking prerequisite courses for medical school, she didn't laugh or look skeptical. Instead, she said, "Good for you. Medicine needs people who understand what it's like to struggle." She started letting me shadow her on rounds when my volunteer duties were light. I watched her examine patients, explain diagnoses, and coordinate with other specialists. She taught me to recognize the subtle signs of distress that patients often couldn't articulate, the way someone's breathing changed when they were in pain, how fear manifested in their posture, the importance of really listening to what people said and what they didn't say. One Saturday morning, I was delivering lab results when I encountered Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who spoke limited English and seemed confused about her upcoming procedure. The nursing staff was busy, and I could see her anxiety escalating. Drawing on my high school Spanish and my growing medical vocabulary, I sat with her and slowly explained what would happen during her cardiac catheterization. Dr. Kim witnessed this interaction and pulled me aside afterward. "You have good instincts," she said. "You connect with patients in a way that can't be taught." Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong in medicine. Those words sustained me through the hardest parts of my preparation. When organic chemistry felt impossible, I remembered Mrs. Rodriguez's grateful smile. When physics equations made my head spin, I thought about the difference I could make as a doctor. When my family made offhand comments about my phase of taking evening classes, I fingered my volunteer badge in my pocket and reminded myself that I belonged in that hospital. The volunteer program also gave me stories to tell in my eventual medical school applications. I learned about healthcare disparities firsthand, working with patients who couldn't afford medications or had delayed seeking care due to financial constraints. I saw how language barriers affected patient outcomes and how important it was to approach each person with empathy and cultural sensitivity. More importantly, those Saturday mornings confirmed that medicine was truly my calling. The long hours of studying felt worthwhile when I could apply what I was learning to real patient situations. Understanding the physiology behind heart failure wasn't just academic anymore. It was directly relevant to helping people like Mrs. Rodriguez understand their conditions and treatment options. After 6 months of volunteering, the charge nurse offered me a part-time position as a patient care technician. It meant leaving my receptionist job at the clinic, but it also meant being more deeply embedded in the medical environment I was fighting to join. I accepted immediately, knowing that every hour I spent in that hospital was preparing me for the career I was determined to achieve. The first MCAT score report arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I knew from the thin envelope that it wasn't good news. My hands shook as I opened it. Seeing the number that represented 2 years of preparation, 502, below the 50th percentile, not competitive for medical school admission, I sat on my couch, staring at that score for a long time. All the color-coded schedules, the sacrificed social life, the ramen noodle dinners, the late nights studying until my eyes burned, and I had scored below average. The voice in my head, that sounded like my mother's gentle disappointment, whispered, "Maybe you should be realistic about your abilities." That afternoon, I went to work at the hospital with my usual enthusiasm dampened. During my lunch break, I found myself in the chapel, not because I was particularly religious, but because it was quiet and empty. I needed a place to process what felt like a devastating failure. Dr. Kim found me there, staring at the stained glass windows. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just sat beside me in comfortable silence. Finally, I pulled out the score report and handed it to her. She looked at it thoughtfully, then said, "What did you learn from this experience?" "That I'm not as smart as I thought I was," I replied bitterly. "Wrong answer," she said firmly. "You learned that the MCAT is a specific type of test that requires specific preparation strategies. You learned that your first attempt at something difficult doesn't define your potential. Most importantly, you learned that you're not going to give up." She was right, of course. The MACT wasn't just a test of knowledge. It was a test of test-taking, strategies, time management, and mental endurance. My ADHD, even with medication and accommodations, made standardized tests particularly challenging. I processed information more slowly than average, which meant I often ran out of time on sections even when I knew the material. That evening, my family gathered for Marcus's birthday dinner. As we sat around the table, my parents proudly discussed his latest case and Emma's recent promotion. At one point, my mother looked at me and said, "Sarah, you've been so quiet lately with all those classes you're taking. I hope you're not overwhelming yourself. Sometimes it's better to accept our limitations and focus on what we're good at." The irony was crushing. Here I was, having just failed the most important test of my life, and my family was unknowingly reinforcing every doubt I had about my abilities. I wanted to scream that I had just spent 2 years studying harder than they could imagine, that I was trying to become a doctor, that their realistic expectations for me were insulting. Instead, I smiled and said, "I'm fine, Mom, just figuring things out." But privately, I was already planning my comeback. That night, I researched MCAT retake strategies, signed up for a more comprehensive prep course, and scheduled sessions with a learning disability specialist who could help me develop better test-taking techniques. I also applied for extended time accommodations, something I hadn't known was available during my first attempt. The score report went into my desk drawer next to my old high school transcript, to pieces of paper that documented my academic struggles but wouldn't define my future. I had 6 months before the next MCAT administration. and I was going to use every single day to prove that my first score was not my final score. Failure, I realized, was just information. It told me what I needed to work on, not whether I should give up, and I definitely was not giving up. Dr. Peterson's email arrived 6 months after my disappointing mixed score, and it changed everything. He was a cardiologist at the University Medical Center who was looking for a research assistant for a study on heart failure outcomes in underserved populations. My volunteer supervisor at St. Mary's had recommended me, mentioning my work with Spanish-speaking patients and my interest in medical school. The position paid barely above minimum wage, but it offered something invaluable, the chance to contribute to real medical research. I would be helping to collect data, interact with study participants, and assist with manuscript preparation. For someone whose family thought she was only capable of administrative work, it felt like a door opening to a world I'd only dreamed of entering. My first day in Dr. Peterson's lab was intimidating. The other research assistants were all pre-med students from prestigious universities, with impressive GPAs and multiple research experiences already under their belts. I was a 27-year-old hospital worker with an associate's degree and a below-average MCAT score. I felt like an imposter in a white coat. But Dr. Peterson had a different perspective. "I don't care about your undergraduate degree," he told me during our first meeting. "I care about your work ethic and your ability to connect with patients. Research is only as good as the data we collect, and patients need to trust the people collecting that data." The study focused on medication adherence among heart failure patients from low-income communities. My job was to conduct follow-up interviews, help patients understand their treatment plans, and track their health outcomes over time. It was exactly the kind of work that played to my strengths: patient interaction, language skills, and genuine empathy for people facing health challenges. Over the course of 18 months, I interviewed hundreds of patients. I learned about the impossible choices people made between buying medications and paying rent, the cultural barriers that prevented some patients from trusting medical advice, and the systemic inequalities that affected health outcomes. This research gave context to everything I was studying in my prerequisite courses. More importantly, I discovered that I had a talent for research methodology. I noticed patterns in the data that others missed, asked questions that led to important insights, and developed strategies for improving patient recruitment and retention. Dr. Peterson began including me in manuscript planning meetings and asking for my input on study design. The breakthrough came when I identified a correlation between social support systems and medication adherence that hadn't been previously documented in the literature. Patients with strong family support networks had significantly better outcomes, but the effect was most pronounced among patients who also had bilingual family members who could help navigate the healthcare system. Dr. Peterson was excited about this finding and asked me to take the lead on writing that section of our paper. I spent weeks crafting those paragraphs, revising and refining every sentence until they perfectly captured what we had discovered. When the paper was accepted for publication in the Journal of Cardiac Medicine, my name appeared as second author. Seeing Sarah Chen in print in a peer-reviewed medical journal was surreal. This was proof, tangible, published proof, that I could contribute meaningfully to medical knowledge. I wasn't just dreaming about becoming a doctor. I was already functioning as a member of the medical research community. The research experience also gave me confidence for my MECT retake. Understanding how medical knowledge was created and applied made the test material feel more relevant and manageable. I wasn't just memorizing facts anymore. I was learning concepts that I had seen in action during my work with real patients. When Dr. Peterson wrote my letter of recommendation for medical school, he didn't focus on my academic history or test scores. Instead, he wrote about my research contributions, my patient interaction skills, and my potential to make meaningful contributions to medicine. Finally, someone in the medical field saw me as more than just my limitations. They saw my possibilities. The second MCAT score report arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and this time the envelope felt different in my hands, heavier, more substantial. I had learned not to judge results by packaging, but something felt different about this moment. I had spent 6 months preparing for this retake, with a level of intensity that bordered on obsession. Extended time accommodations for my ADHD meant I could work through problems at my natural pace instead of racing against an impossible clock. a better prep course that focused on test-taking strategies rather than just content review. Most importantly, the confidence that came from knowing I belonged in the medical field. Thanks to my research experience with Dr. Peterson. My hands were steady as I opened the envelope this time. The number that greeted me seemed impossible. 516, 95th percentile. A score that would make me competitive at any medical school in the country. I read it 3 times before the reality sank in. I had gone from below average to the top 5% of tests. The girl who had struggled through high school chemistry had just aced one of the most challenging standardized tests in higher education. I called Dr. Peterson immediately. "Congratulations," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "But I'm not surprised. I've seen your work. I know what you're capable of." That afternoon, I walked through the hospital where I worked with a secret that felt too big to contain. The nurses who chatted with me during shift changes, the residents who had gotten used to seeing me around, the attending physicians who occasionally asked my opinion about difficult patients, none of them knew that I had just achieved something that would have seemed impossible 3 years ago. The score opened doors that had been firmly closed before. Medical schools that wouldn't have given my application a second glance with my first score would now seriously consider my candidacy. The research experience, volunteer work, and prerequisite courses that had felt like long shots suddenly became competitive advantages. But the most profound change was internal. For 27 years, I had carried the weight of being not smart enough. That MCAT score didn't just qualify me for medical school, it proved that I was intellectually capable of excelling in the most demanding academic environments. That night, I allowed myself to dream bigger than I ever had before. Not just medical school, but top-tier medical school. Not just becoming a doctor, but becoming the kind of doctor who could make significant contributions to medicine. The research skills I had developed, combined with my patient care experience and now proven academic ability, positioned me to potentially impact healthcare in ways I had never imagined possible. I still didn't tell my family about my score or my medical school plans. They continued to see me as someone who was finally settling into a stable job at the hospital. But privately, I began preparing for the next phase of my journey. Medical school applications, personal statements, interview preparation, all the components of transforming from an aspiring pre-med student into an actual medical school candidate. The score report went into a frame on my wall, right next to my published research paper. 2 pieces of evidence that I was ready for the next chapter of my life. Even if my family wasn't ready to believe it yet, I had spent years proving to myself that I could do this. Soon, I would have the chance to prove it to everyone else. The medical school application essay stared back at me from my laptop screen, cursor blinking impatiently after the prompt. Describe a challenging situation you have overcome and how it has prepared you for a career in medicine. Where do I even begin? I thought. Do I write about being labeled the dumb one for most of my life? The learning disability diagnosis that finally explained my academic struggles, the 2 years of grinding through prerequisite courses while working full-time, the devastating first MCAT score that nearly derailed my dreams. I had been staring at this blank document for 3 hours, paralyzed by the weight of condensing my entire transformation into a compelling narrative. Every pre-med forum I had read emphasized the importance of the personal statement. This wasn't just an essay, was my chance to explain why someone with my unconventional background deserved a spot in medical school. Finally, I started typing. At 24, I was diagnosed with ADHD and a learning disability. The neuropsychologist who delivered this news apologized, as if she were informing me of a terminal illness. But for me, that diagnosis was liberation. For the first time in my life, I had an explanation for why traditional learning methods had never worked, why I had been labeled as lacking academic potential, and why I had spent years believing I wasn't intelligent enough for ambitious goals. Words began flowing as I wrote about my journey from community college to medical school applicant. I described the color-coded study schedules, the volunteer work that confirmed my passion for patient care, the research experience that proved I could contribute to medical knowledge, and the MATWA trait that demonstrated my academic capabilities. But the hardest part was writing about my family without sounding bitter or resentful. How do you explain that the people who should have been your biggest supporters were the ones who had to be convinced of your worth? I chose to frame it as motivation rather than obstacle. Growing up as the underachieving middle child in a family of high achievers taught me empathy for patients who feel overlooked or misunderstood by the healthcare system. My experience with learning disabilities gives me insight into how different people process information and receive care. My unconventional path to medicine has shown me that potential can't always be measured by traditional metrics. The personal statement went through 17 drafts over 3 months. Dr. Peterson reviewed it, offering suggestions for highlighting my research contributions. Dr. Kim from the hospital helped me articulate my patient care philosophy. Even my undergraduate chemistry professor, who had watched me struggle and ultimately succeed in her courses, provided feedback on making my academic transformation more compelling. But beyond the personal statement, the application process was overwhelming in its complexity. Each school required supplementary essays, letters of recommendation, transcripts from multiple institutions, and detailed documentation of my clinical and research experiences. The application fees alone cost more than I made in a month. I applied to 30 medical schools, casting a wide net that included state schools where my residency status might give me an advantage, mid-tier private schools that valued diverse backgrounds, and reach schools that probably wouldn't consider someone with my profile but were worth the attempt. The most ambitious application was to Johns Hopkins. Their emphasis on research and their reputation for academic excellence made them seem impossibly selective for someone like me. But Dr. Peterson encouraged me to apply, pointing out that my research experience and unique background might actually make me stand out in a positive way. As I hit submit on each application, I felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. After years of preparing in secret, I was finally putting myself out there. Win or lose, I was officially in the game. The waiting period stretched ahead of me like an eternity, but I had already proven to myself that I could handle uncertainty and setbacks. Whatever happened next, I was ready for it. The interview thank you notes were stacked on my desk like a paper trail of hope, each one carefully handwritten, personalized with specific details from my conversations with faculty members, admissions, committee members, and current students. After 3 months of traveling to medical school interviews across the country, I had accumulated quite a collection. The first interview invitation came from my state university medical school in October. I had been checking my email obsessively for weeks, refreshing my inbox every few minutes like an anxious teenager waiting for a text back. When I saw the subject line interview invitation, School of Medicine, I actually screamed out loud in my apartment. That first interview was terrifying. I spent a week preparing answers to common questions, researching the school's curriculum and mission, and practicing in front of my bathroom mirror. I bought my first professional suit, a navy blue ensemble that made me feel like I was playing dress up as a serious adult. The day of the interview, I arrived an hour early and sat in my car in the parking lot, going over my notes one final time. The other candidates looked impossibly young and confident, chatting icily about their undergraduate experiences at prestigious universities. I felt ancient at 28, and my community college background seemed glaringly obvious. But something magical happened during my actual interview. The committee members, a cardiologist, a family medicine physician, and a current medical student, were genuinely interested in my story. They asked thoughtful questions about my research, my experience working with underserved populations, and my perspective on healthcare disparities. "Your background is exactly what medicine needs," the cardiologist told me. "We have plenty of students with perfect transcripts from day one. We need people who understand struggle, who can relate to patients facing challenges, who bring real-world experience to their medical education." By December, I had interviewed at 8 schools scattered across the country. Each trip required careful budgeting, cheap flights, shared hotel rooms, budget car rentals. I was burning through my savings, but each interview felt like validation that I belonged in this process. The Johns Hopkins interview was scheduled for a cold February morning in Baltimore. I had flown in the night before, staying at a budget motel near the airport because downtown hotels were beyond my means. As I walked through the prestigious medical school campus, I felt simultaneously intimidated and determined. Dr. Sarah Brennan, the interviewer assigned to me, was a renowned infectious disease specialist whose research I had studied extensively. She didn't start with typical interview questions. Instead, she said, "Tell me about a time when you failed and what you learned from it." I talked about my first MCAT score, the months of self-doubt that followed, and the systematic approach I took to improvement. I explained how that experience taught me that failure was information, not verdict, and how it prepared me for the inevitable setbacks I would face in medical school and beyond. Resilience can't be taught, she said at the end of our conversation. But it can be recognized. You've already proven you have what it takes to succeed here. Each thank you note I wrote after these interviews was more than just courtesy. It was my chance to reinforce why I belonged in their program. I referenced specific conversations, asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and reiterated my commitment to their institution's mission. By March, I had a collection of business cards, program brochures, and memories of conversations that had changed how I saw myself. I was no longer the community college dropout pretending to be. I was a legitimate medical school candidate with something valuable to offer. The calendar hanging above my desk was marked with red X's for each passing day, counting down to the medical school decision deadlines, March 30th for most schools, with rolling admissions extending into April for others. Each date felt like a small judgment day, and I had circled them all in increasingly anxious pen strokes. The waiting was excruciating. I had done everything I could, submitted strong applications, interviewed well, sent thoughtful follow-up notes. Now I was completely powerless, dependent on admissions committees I would never meet, making decisions about my future based on a paper representation of my life. The first response came from a mid-tier private school in the Midwest. Wait, not a rejection, but not the acceptance I desperately wanted. I researched what being waitlisted meant, learning that some schools accepted up to 30% of their class from the waitlist, while others accepted virtually no one. It was medical school purgatory, hope without certainty. 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived from a state school where I had felt particularly confident after the interview. Rejected. The thin letter contained polite language about the competitive nature of their applicant pool and encouragement to reapply if I remained interested. I sat in my car outside the post office and cried for 10 minutes. Letting myself feel the disappointment before driving back to work at the hospital. Dr. Kim found me that afternoon, restocking supply closets with unusual intensity, attacking the task like my life depended on perfectly organized gauze packages. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just handed me a cup of coffee and said, "The right program will recognize what you have to offer. Sometimes the timing isn't right, but that doesn't mean you aren't good enough." March stretched endlessly. Every day brought the possibility of life-changing news, but also the growing fear that I had overestimated my competitiveness. The online forums were full of other applicants celebrating acceptances or commiserating about rejections, and I felt increasingly isolated in my uncertainty. 3 more rejections arrived in quick succession, each one feeling like a small death. The rational part of my brain knew that medical school admissions were incredibly competitive and that rejection didn't reflect my worth as a person or future physician. The emotional part of my brain whispered that maybe my family had been right all along. Maybe I was reaching beyond my capabilities. The hardest part was maintaining the facade at work and with my family. I couldn't tell them about the rejections because I hadn't told them about the applications. So I smiled and went through my normal routines while privately processing what felt like failure after years of preparation. One evening, sitting in my apartment surrounded by rejection letters, I almost called Marcus. I wanted to tell someone about what I was going through, to share the weight of these disappointments with a family member who might understand the academic pressure. But I couldn't face the possibility of his pity or his relief that I was being brought back down to earth. Instead, I called Dr. Peterson. "Rejection is part of the process," he reminded me. I was rejected from my top choice medical school and ended up at a program that was perfect for my research interests. Sometimes what feels like setback is actually redirection toward something better. By the end of March, I had been rejected from 6 schools, waitlisted at 3, and was still waiting to hear from the most competitive programs on my list. The calendar on my wall looked like a battlefield, with more red marks indicating rejections than the green marks I had optimistically planned for acceptances. But I wasn't giving up. Each morning, I checked my email with a mixture of dread and hope, knowing that one acceptance could transform all these rejections into footnotes in my success story. The Johns Hopkins acceptance letter arrived on April 15th, exactly 1 month after my 28th birthday. I knew what it was the moment I saw the thick envelope in my mailbox, but I couldn't process it immediately. I had been conditioned by weeks of thin rejection letters to expect disappointment. I carried the envelope upstairs to my apartment, set it on my kitchen table, and stared at it for 5 full minutes. The return address read Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in elegant script, and the envelope was heavy enough that I could feel multiple pages inside. When I finally opened it, the first words I saw were congratulations. It is with great pleasure that we offer you admission to the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, class of 2027. I read that sentence 5 times before the reality began to sink in. Johns Hopkins, one of the most prestigious medical schools in the world, the institution that had trained countless Nobel Prize winners, pioneering researchers, and medical leaders, and they wanted me. The acceptance packet was thick with information about orientation, housing options, financial aid, and program details. But I was fixated on the letter itself, specifically the paragraph that explained why I had been selected. Your unique background, demonstrated resilience, and commitment to serving underserved populations make you exactly the kind of physician we hope to train. Your research experience and clinical work show a maturity and perspective that will enrich our learning community. They didn't just tolerate my unconventional path, they valued it. The community college years, the learning disability diagnosis, the struggle to prove myself academically, all of it was seen as an asset rather than a liability. I called Dr. Peterson first. I knew it, he said, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. Hopkins doesn't just accept students with good stats, they accept students who will make meaningful contributions to medicine. You're going to do incredible things there. Next, I called Dr. Kim at the hospital. When I told her the news, she actually cheered loudly enough that other staff members came to see what was happening. We're losing an amazing team member, she announced to the nurses' station. But medicine is gaining an incredible future physician. That afternoon, I walked through the hospital where I had worked for the past 2 years with a secret that felt too big to contain. The same hallways where I had volunteered, learned, and grown, now felt like a launching pad to something extraordinary. Every patient I interacted with, every medical procedure I observed, every conversation with physicians took on new meaning. Soon, I would be learning to do these things myself. The financial aid package arrived 2 days later, and it was more generous than I had dared to hope. Between grants, scholarships, and loans, my medical education would be covered. The girl who had eaten ramen noodles for months to afford MCAT prep materials was going to attend one of the most expensive medical schools in the country, without crippling debt. But the most profound moment came when I framed the acceptance letter and hung it on my wall next to my MEC score report and published research paper. 3 pieces of paper that told the story of my transformation from family disappointment to medical school student at one of the world's most prestigious institutions. I still hadn't told my family. That conversation deserved to happen in person, with the proper dramatic impact. They had spent years managing their expectations for me, protecting themselves from disappointment by assuming I would never achieve anything remarkable. They had no idea that their unremarkable daughter was about to become Dr. Sarah Chen. The family dinner was scheduled for a Sunday in late April, ostensibly to celebrate Emma's latest promotion to vice president at her investment firm. I had requested that everyone be there, claiming I had some news to share but refusing to elaborate. My parents probably expected an announcement about a new job, or maybe a relationship, something appropriately modest for their underachieving daughter. I arrived early, carrying a manila folder that contained my framed Johns Hopkins acceptance letter. I had rehearsed this moment for weeks, but my hands were still shaking as I walked into my childhood home. The familiar setting felt surreal. The living room where I had struggled through homework while my siblings excelled. The dining room where countless conversations had centered around Marcus's law cases and Emma's financial deals. The kitchen where my mother had gently managed expectations about my academic potential. All of it was about to change forever. Marcus arrived first, looking polished in his weekend casual clothes that probably cost more than my monthly salary. He kissed Mom on the cheek and immediately launched into a story about his latest courtroom victory. Emma followed shortly after, radiating the confidence that came with closing million-dollar deals before breakfast. We gathered around the dining room table with the good china, as was tradition for family celebrations. Dad carved the roast while Mom fussed over side dishes, both of them beaming with pride as Emma described her new responsibilities and salary increase. "Sarah, you've been so quiet," Mom said as we finished the main course. "What's your news? Please tell me you're not quitting your job at the hospital." You've finally found something stable. I took a deep breath and pulled out the manila folder. Actually, I am leaving my job at the hospital. In August, I'll be starting medical school. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus and Emma stopped mid-chew. Dad's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Mom looked confused, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. Medical school. Marcus finally said, Sarah, that's a huge commitment. Are you sure you've thought this through? The MCAT is extremely difficult, and the prerequisites I scored in the 95th percentile on the I interrupted, pulling out the score report. I completed all the prerequisite courses over the past 3 years. I've been doing cardiovascular research and have a published paper in the Journal of Cardiac Medicine. I placed each piece of evidence on the table as I spoke. The MC8 score report, the research publication with my name as second author, the transcript from my prerequisite courses showing a 3.9 GPA, and finally, the framed acceptance letter. Emma picked up the Johns Hopkins letter, her eyes widening as she read, This is real, Johns Hopkins. Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper, Sarah, Johns Hopkins is one of the best medical schools in the country. I know, I said quietly. They accepted me because of my research experience, my clinical work, and my perspective on healthcare disparities. Apparently, struggling to learn in traditional academic settings gave me insights that strata students might not have. Mom was staring at the acceptance letter like it might disappear. But Sarah, you never said anything about wanting to be a doctor. You barely passed high school science. I've been preparing for this for 5 years, I explained. I didn't tell you because I needed to prove it to myself first. I needed to know I could do this before I asked you to believe in me. The room fell silent again as my family processed this information. Marcus picked up my published research paper, scanning the abstract with obvious confusion. Emma was calculating something on her phone, probably the earning potential of a Johns Hopkins trained physician. Finally, Dad spoke. Sarah, I don't understand. If you were capable of this level of achievement, why did you struggle so much in school? I have ADHD and a learning disability, I said. I was finally diagnosed and got proper treatment when I was 24. Turns out, I'm not stupid. I just needed to learn how to work with my brain instead of against it. The revelation hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about me. For 28 years, they had built their understanding of our family around the assumption that I was the one who couldn't keep up academically. Now they were being forced to confront the possibility that they had been wrong. Mom started crying. Not tears of joy, but tears of something more complex. Regret, perhaps, or confusion. Sarah, if we had known... It doesn't matter now, I said, gently. What matters is that I figured it out, and I'm going to be a doctor. The congratulations that followed felt hollow and delayed, like applause after a long pause. Marcus was the first to recover, switching into lawyer mode as he examined my acceptance portfolio with professional interest. This is really impressive, Sarah, I mean, genuinely impressive. Johns Hopkins doesn't accept people lightly. But I could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to reconcile this new information with years of assumptions about his little sister's capabilities. Emma was more direct in her confusion. I don't understand how you kept this secret for 5 years. The MCAT prep alone must have taken months. It took 2 years, I corrected, and I failed it the first time. But I learned from that failure, and did better the second time. Mom was still processing the learning disability revelation. Why didn't you tell us you were struggling? We could have gotten you help. This was the moment I had dreaded, but also the conversation we needed to have. Mom, I tried to tell you I was struggling. Remember all those parent-teacher conferences? The tutoring sessions that didn't help. The guidance counselor meetings about my potential. Everyone assumed I just wasn't academic material, including me. But we never would have discouraged you from pursuing medicine if we had known you were capable. Dad protested. I pulled out a folder I had brought specifically for this conversation, my medical school acceptance portfolio, complete with personal statements, research summaries, and recommendation letters. This is everything I accomplished while you thought I was just taking some continuing education classes. 2 years of prerequisite courses with a 3.9 GPA, 18 months of cardiovascular research resulting in a published paper, MCAT score in the 95th percentile, hospital volunteer work and patient care experience. Marcus picked up one of my research papers, scanning the methodology section. Sarah, This is graduate level work. How did you even know how to design a study like this? I learned, I said simply. Turns out when you find something you're passionate about and you have the right learning support, you can accomplish things that seemed impossible before. The conversation that followed was painful, but necessary. I explained how their well-meaning attempts to manage my expectations had actually limited my vision for my own future. How being called the creative one felt like a consolation prize. How their relief at my community college graduation felt like lowered standards rather than celebration. We were trying to protect you from disappointment, Mom said defensively. You were protecting yourselves from disappointment, I replied, more gently than I felt. It was easier to believe I couldn't achieve at a high level than to consider that maybe I just needed different support. Emma, ever practical, asked about the financial implications. When I explained my aid package and loan situation, she looked impressed. Do you know what Johns Hopkins physicians earn? Sarah, you're going to outturn all of us eventually. But this wasn't about money or status or proving I was better than my siblings. It was about years of being underestimated and the satisfaction of proving that assessment wrong. It was about the little girl who had struggled with basic multiplication tables growing up to study the complexities of human physiology. It was about transforming from the family disappointment into someone they could finally be proud of. I need you to understand something, I said, looking at each of them in turn. I didn't do this for your approval or to prove you wrong. I did it because I knew I had more to offer than anyone believed. But I also need you to know that your lack of belief in me made this journey much harder than it needed to be. The silence that followed was heavy with years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. Finally, Dad spoke. Sarah, we're proud of you. We're also sorry that we didn't see your potential earlier. It wasn't everything I had hoped for, but it was a beginning. After 28 years of being the family underachiever, I was finally being seen for who I really was, someone capable of extraordinary things. The white coat ceremony at Johns Hopkins took place on a humid August morning in Baltimore. As I stood in the auditorium wearing my pristine white coat for the first time, I felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The coat itself was simple white cotton, with my name embroidered in navy blue thread, but it represented a transformation that had taken 5 years to complete. My parents sat in the third row, flanked by Marcus and Emma. 3 months had passed since my revelation dinner, and our relationships were still adjusting to this new reality. They had come to Baltimore for the ceremony, bringing flowers and cameras like proud parents, but I could still see confusion in their eyes when they looked at me. It was as if they were meeting their daughter for the first time. Dr. Peterson was there too, sitting with other faculty members and research mentors. When our eyes met across the auditorium, he gave me a thumbs up that made me smile. He had been one of the first people to see my potential, and his belief in me had been crucial during the darkest moments of my journey. The dean's speech about professionalism and commitment felt surreal. Here I was, surrounded by some of the brightest students in the country, being welcomed into the medical profession at one of its most prestigious institutions. The girl who had been told she wasn't academic material was about to take the Hippocratic Oath alongside future leaders in medicine. When they called my name, Sarah Chen, I walked across the stage with confidence I had never possessed before. The applause felt different from the polite clapping I had received at my community college graduation. This was recognition of genuine achievement, acknowledgement that I belonged in this elite group. The Hippocratic Oath portion of the ceremony was deeply moving, as I recited the ancient words promising to first do no harm and to dedicate my life to healing. I thought about all the patients I had worked with as a volunteer and research assistant, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had needed someone to explain her cardiac procedure in Spanish, the heart failure patients in Dr. Peterson's study who had trusted me with their stories and struggles. All of them had contributed to my understanding of what it meant to be a physician. After the ceremony, my family gathered around me for photos. The pictures from that day show a different Sarah than the one who had hidden in the back corner of Marcus's Harvard graduation photo. This Sarah stood tall, confident, wearing her white coat like it belonged on her shoulders. I still can't believe this is real, Mom said as we posed for pictures outside the medical school building. Dr. Sarah Chen. It has such a nice ring to it. Emma was documenting everything on her phone, already planning social media posts about her sister, the Johns Hopkins medical student. Marcus seemed genuinely proud, though I could tell he was still processing how dramatically the family dynamics had shifted. That evening, at dinner in Little Italy, Dad raised his glass for a toast. To Sarah, who taught us all that potential isn't always obvious and that determination can overcome any obstacle. We're sorry it took us so long to see what you were capable of. It wasn't a complete apology for years of low expectations, but it was acknowledgement that they had been wrong about me. More importantly, it was a promise to see me differently going forward. As I looked around the table at my family, no longer the disappointing middle child, but now Dr. Chunin, realized that their opinion of me mattered less than it once had. I had spent so many years seeking their validation that I had forgotten to validate myself. The white coat hanging in my new apartment near Johns Hopkins was proof that I didn't need anyone else's permission to pursue my dreams. I had given that permission to myself, and that had made all the difference. The newest family photo sits on my mother's mantelpiece now, right next to the old one from Marcus's Harvard graduation. In this one, taken during my second year at Johns Hopkins, I'm wearing my white coat and stethoscope, standing confidently between my parents, who beam with unmistakable pride. Marcus and Emma flank us, both looking genuinely happy for my success. The contrast between the two photos tells the complete story of my transformation. 3 years have passed since that August day when I first put on my white coat, and everything about my family dynamics has changed. I'm no longer the afterthought or the one who tries her best. I'm Dr. Chen, the daughter who defied everyone's expectations, including my own. Marcus and I now have conversations about our careers as equals. He asks my opinion about medical legal cases he's working on, and I consult him about the business aspects of healthcare. Emma has become one of my biggest supporters, introducing me to her colleagues as my sister, the Johns Hopkins medical student with obvious pride. But the most significant change has been in my parents' perspective. Mom, who once worried about my ability to hold down a stable job, now brags to her friends about her daughter who's going to be a cardiologist. Dad, who used to look confused when I struggled with basic math, now asks detailed questions about my research on cardiac arrhythmias in diabetic patients. Last month, I gave a presentation at a medical conference about healthcare disparities in underserved communities, research that grew out of my work with Dr. Peterson. My parents attended, sitting in the back row and watching their formerly academic daughter present complex medical research to an audience of practicing physicians. After my presentation, a young woman approached me during the reception. She was about 22, looked nervous, and introduced herself as a community college student who was thinking about pre-med but worried she wasn't smart enough for medical school. I heard about your background, she said quietly. Is it really possible to get into a good medical school if you didn't start at a 4-year university? I spent 20 minutes talking with her about alternative pathways to medicine, the importance of getting proper learning support if needed, and the value of diverse perspectives in healthcare. As she walked away with my contact information and a list of resources, I realized that my story had become more than just personal vindication. It had become inspiration for others who felt like outsiders in the medical field. The irony of my journey isn't lost on me. The family that once called me the dumb one now uses my achievements as evidence of their excellent parenting. The girl who was told she wasn't academic material is now teaching medical students and conducting research that contributes to medical knowledge. The daughter who was expected to settle for modest goals is on track to become the kind of physician who changes how medicine is practiced. But the most important transformation isn't in how others see me, it's in how I see myself. I no longer need external validation to know my worth. I don't require my family's approval to pursue ambitious goals. The confidence that I've built through overcoming seemingly impossible challenges is unshakable. Next month, I'll graduate from Johns Hopkins and start my residency in cardiology at Mass General. The little girl who struggled to understand basic science concepts will be learning to perform heart surgery. The teenager whose guidance counselor suggested realistic career goals will be training at one of the most competitive medical programs in the country. To anyone who has ever been told they're not smart enough, not talented enough, or not capable enough, your current circumstances don't define your future potential. Sometimes the people who love us most are also the ones who can't see our capabilities. Sometimes we have to prove it to ourselves first before anyone else will believe it. My family called me the dumb one for 28 years. Now they call me Dr. Chen. The difference isn't in my intelligence, it was always there. The difference is that I finally stopped accepting other people's limitations as my own reality and started writing my own story instead. Share your own stories of proving people wrong in the comments below. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming who you were always meant to be.